Now on Radio 4, Laurie Taylor travels to Budapest to uncover the story of an extraordinary broadcasting first. The 19th century company pioneering the kind of daily programming which radio listeners now take for granted. How was this possible before wireless? Listen on to Electric News.
When I'm listening to the Telefon newspaper, I feel it's a miracle. It makes me proud as a Hungarian woman to know that this bright idea took root in our Hungarian soil. We don't need to go out for news, learning or music. It's brought right into our cozy rooms.
A most lezárt számadásokból kitűnik, hogy az idei télen a rendkívüli havazások rengeteg pénzébe kerültek a fővárosnak.
I'm standing in the huge Kerepesi cemetery, which is to the east of central Budapest. Huge, long avenues, and so large that it's taken me a long time to find my way past all the other luminaries who are buried here, all the poets and prime ministers and artists, actors, architects, and eventually find the grave that I was looking for. Not a very large grave, but it is a grave of a Hungarian hero. What I'm looking at is a tall obelisk, grey marble. The odds are you've never heard of the man who lies beneath the earth here. His name is Puskás. No, it's not the famous footballer, not Ferenc Puskás. This one is Theodor Puskás, Theodor Puskás, we'd say. And the inscription on the obelisk gives his claim to, well, more or less eternal fame. It says he invented the Telefon Hirmondo, translated the telephone newspaper. And that was the name that Puskás gave to the brainchild which dazzled Budapest way back in 1893. It was the world's very first broadcasting organisation, as we understand the idea of a broadcasting organisation, a radio station, if you like, in all but name. But this wasn't wireless. Oh no, Puskás used the telephone.
We greet the inhabitants of Budapest. We greet them in an unusual way, through which telephone broadcasting all over the world will start its victorious journey.
Theodor Puskás's words that introduced the first day's broadcasting by this telephone newspaper on February the 15th, 1893. A broadcast transmitted from this rather undistinguished Budapest thoroughfare, Magyar Street. Well, today, there's no trace of that original building. But I wonder, was what took place here genuinely revolutionary? I mean, did Hungary really beat everyone else to viable daily broadcasting by around 30 years? A very ancient communication device, the church bell sounding from the Mátyás Church up in the Buda Castle area, and drawing me towards the telephone exhibits at the Telefon Museum, which is just up the road. They got a special exhibition there devoted to Theodor Puskás and his Telefon Hirmondo. The first exhibit which has attracted my attention is this rather marvellous mock-up. Here is a 19th century newsreader actually reading out the news. And of course what we notice is that coming from the two microphones into which he's speaking is this pretty thick telephone cable which winds its way around. And of course it's going to be through the cable stretching right around the city, that in fact people are going to be able to pick up and listen to the news that he is now reading. But just to the left of him, standing up in a very, very dignified pose, a rather operatic-looking singer, complete with hat, about to perform what looks like an aria. She has two microphones in front of her. These microphones are on a stand, and once again there's the ubiquitous piece of cable trailing away from those microphones and going into the telephone network of Budapest. One of the stars who sang live to Telefon Hirmondo listeners, Luisa Blaha. But now, at the other end of those cables that I was describing a moment ago, here we have the domestic reception of all that singing and newsreading. Here are a lady sitting in her chair with earphones. On her left, a standing gentleman in a suit, also with earphones on. They are plugged into the wall. You can see the wall socket from which the cables come. There's really rather something odd about the idea that you really can't join in much conversation about what's going on because you have to have earphones on in order to be able to listen. But as the system was developed, we gradually do move to a situation in which loudspeakers can be attached to the telephone systems. And up here above me on the ceiling, I have enormous loudspeakers, great open horns about 3 feet across, which did enable the sound from the telephone to be projected so people could hear it without actually having earphones. Well, I'm speaking now to the curator of this exhibition, Laszlo Jakab. Can you tell me all the things that could be heard from Telefon Hirmondo?
Szinte mindent lehetett hallani a Telefon Hirmondóban.
You could hear almost everything via Telefon Hirmondo, and it was always developing and improving. Most important was stock market news, but also political and other news from home and abroad. Then all kinds of information and entertainment, for instance, language lessons and cooking lessons. Listeners could hear authors talking about their work and reading from their newest novels. And of course there was also sport and music and stories for children.
It's difficult to know, of course, what exactly the sound was like that you were getting over those earphones at the time. But here on the wall of the museum, it provides an opportunity for me to lift up one of those typical earphones and hear the news.
1893. február 15. Budapesti gabonatőzsde jelentése. Búzát ma mérsékelten kínáltak, a kereslet korlátolt volt.
And interesting to know that the quality of the earphones that you might have at any time rather depended upon your status, because right over here there's an exhibit that I spotted a little bit earlier, which is really quite wonderful. These are the earphones that personally belong to the long-serving Austro-Hungarian Emperor Franz Joseph. They look as though they might be made of gold, but I suspect it's just gold-plated.
Subscribers to Telefon Hirmondo are brought into immediate contact with the racecourse, the cycling and automobile track, the football field, and the billiard table. A music programme is given every night. A subscriber toasting his feet before his own fire and sipping his claret can listen in absolute comfort to Sousa's band or Adelina Patti's masterful rendering of Home Sweet Home.
One of the many reports in the foreign press about this telephone newspaper, which even carried adverts. Well, I'm now on the oldest of the Budapest metro lines, which dates from the time Telefon Hirmondo came into being. Yes, 2 exciting new communication technologies of the age. The metro snaked its way round the city, just as the telephone lines did.
Well, I'm now here in the Radio and Television Museum in Budapest. It's right next door to Magyar Radio. And I'm managed to drag myself away from the dance set majors and the radiograms and the boxes of gramophone needles. Oh dear, oh dear. But I managed to drag myself away from those and come over here because I'm now going to speak to István Salomon, who's a radio historian. Will you tell me what that is?
Ez egy úgynevezett fali vezetéktartó, előfizetői transformátorral.
This is one of the supports carrying the Telefon Hirmondo cables, together with a transformer, that date all the way back to 1893. They could use the existing telephone lines, but Pushkash also built a new cable network for Telefon Hirmondo. His cables were attached to walls all around the city. If someone subscribed to Telefon Hirmondo, a worker came and fixed a connection into the building.
One morning, you will find a worker in blue clothes greeting you from your 4th floor window. He wishes you good morning, then without permission starts to drill a hole in the window frame and pushes the end of a cable through. After a while, the bell will ring at your door. Who's that? I'm the serviceman from Telefon Hirmondo. He installs the unit within minutes, then lays a paper on the table saying this is the daily program of the Telefon newspaper. Everyone runs to try it out.
If I have the Telefon Hirmondo in my home,
What does it look like?
Hát a szobában volt két nagy fülhallgató.
There'd be two earphones attached to a board on the wall or onto a table. If you lifted the earphone, you could listen directly to the current programme. There was a special sound, like a jingle on the radio today, which separated the different programmes or signalled important news.
So you could be cooking and suddenly you hear this trumpet-like sound and you rush to hear the sensational news. You put your earphones on. Time we heard more about the founder of the telephone newspaper, Tivadar or Theodore Pushkash, and about the early history of the telephone. At an outpost of the Science Museum in London, curator John Liffin shows us a real collector's item, taking us right back to the invention of the telephone by Alexander Graham Bell in the 1870s.
What I've picked off the shelf is an example of Bell's earliest telephone, an early replica made in the same workshop as the original. You speak through the mouthpiece, you make the diaphragm vibrate, and the armature vibrates, and this varying, fluctuating current is created, which is transmitted downline to a similar instrument somewhere else, which reverses the process and creates sound.
But as John Liffin explains, those who went on to develop the early telephone had to decide what use it might have.
Those pioneers didn't really have an idea about what the telephone might be for, except that it would be good to be able to communicate by words without needing to go through a coded telegraphic message. What they thought the telephone might be used for, if it became widespread, well, we don't know. Some of the uses of the telephone in later years would have been quite unimaginable to those early pioneers.
Theodore Pushkash was one of those pioneers who exploited the new telephone. As a young man, he tried his hand at all sorts of things in various parts of Europe, a travel agency in Vienna, or working for a British railway company that helped build St Pancras Station here in London. A member of the Pushkash family today, Barbara Fally Pushkash, told me a story about this via that often shaky communication device of our own day, the internet.
He got a job for the British railway company, but he couldn't speak English. And so he cut off his hair completely, so he couldn't go out and leave the room. And he studied English day and night. And after he could speak English, he started the job there. For me, the most fascinating thing was how polyglot he was, yeah, and how small the world was at that time, yeah. I mean, he moved from here to there just as people do it right now.
In the mid-1870s, he comes to the U.S., to Colorado, to get involved in this gold mining operation.
American technology historian Paul Israel.
Then he seems to have been one of these people that sort of sees that technology is sort of the future, right? There's all these great new technologies that seem to be emerging, like the telephone, that had a lot of potential. And I think that Pushkash decided that this is what his future might involve.
Pushkash targeted that great American inventor and entrepreneur, Thomas Edison. Laszlo Horváth, a Pushkash authority, says the Hungarian, with the help of a financial backer, made a business proposal to Edison.
Kifizeti az európai jogdíjakat a telefonközpont.
They'd buy the European rights to exploit Edison's patents for the telephone exchange, phonograph and electric light bulb, 1/3 of the income going to Pushkash, 2/3 to Edison. Pushkash was able to prove to Edison that he wasn't a swindler, that he had the money. To impress Edison, he asked if he could send a telegram. Edison was in financial difficulty at the time and was used to sending very short telegrams. But Pushkash sent one that was 2 pages long.
Working as Edison's agent in Paris, Pushkash set up a demonstration at the 1881 International Electrical Exhibition. Visitors could hear a telephonic relay from a local opera house. Communications historian Neil Johansson has evidence of how the wonder was reported.
And what I have here is the front sheet of an illustrated newspaper called The Graphic. At the top of what is really a rather elegant engraving is an image of the telephonic opera room. And you've got elegantly dressed gentlemen and ladies all lined up, headphones on, listening to the opera. It wasn't in the building where they were, it was elsewhere in Paris, and it was live.
This opera relay suggested one way of exploiting the telephone, says John Lippin. Parisian entrepreneurs, for example, set up the Theatrophone company to relay music and theatre.
Theatres were equipped with banks of microphones. You could hire special equipment at home to listen to these transmissions. The idea was successful and it came to London, and London introduced the electrophone in the early 1890s, and that was successful too. In the home, people could put their earphones on, 3 or 4 of them at a time, and all listen to the same entertainment. It's not very different from listening to the radio.
Arriving back here in Budapest, Theodor Puskás developed ideas for using the telephone for much more than entertainment. First, though, he had to take over from his deceased brother the job of developing the national telephone system. When the Telefon Hirmondo eureka moment came, we don't know, says Laszlo Horváth. Puskás was always having eureka moments.
He had ideas every day, like dynamiting rocks to widen the river Danube, or drilling oil wells, or developing airships. And he also had ideas for finding thermal springs. One's named after him, Teodora.
What really drove the idea for Telefon Hirmondo was the public appetite for news. Everything else, the music, the cooking lessons, and all sorts of other things you'd find in a newspaper, spun around that. Up-to-the-minute news was vital. Electric news. Here comes that fanfare again.
...1893. február 15-e. Róma. A pápa a jubileumi alkalmából kiküldött...
The very first Telefon Hirmondo news bulletin was shot along the telephone cables here in Budapest on February the 15th, 1893. Everything from news of the Pope's Jubilee celebrations in Rome and a state ball in St. Petersburg to the latest on snow clearance in Budapest and the Danube in flood. Oh, and the local weather forecast? Mainly dry, wind from the west, mild during the day. Theodor Puskás had created what resembled nothing so much as a 21st century newsroom. Neil Johansson.
Telefon Hirmondo did what a newspaper did. They collected news from wherever they could. They had real journalists. They were a media organisation in their own right. They weren't just repeating other people's news. People could telephone into Puskás's office and create another news story. There were producers, there were presenters, there were studios, all devoted to capturing the programming. They couldn't record it, so it all had to be done very quickly, very effectively, on time, every time.
Puskás's producers and journalists were the very first broadcasters to learn the crucial lesson that listening to news as a consumer is very different from reading it. Back at the Telefonia Museum, Laszlo Jakab.
When you've got a newspaper in front of you, you select what interests you. The rest you don't read. On Telefon Hirmondo, you were forced to listen to all of the news. If anything was boring, people would just switch off. So news had to be very new, very compact and very clear. You couldn't just read it from a newspaper.
A Duna áradása. Az éjszaka óta megint áradt a Duna, és reggelre nagyobb jégcsuszamlás tört.
Well, I'm now in front of the Hungarian telecommunication headquarters, and here, on the little grassy lawn in front of it, this bust, a head and shoulders bust of Puskás, full beard, big bushy moustache, knotted tie, smart suit, very imposing looking. Good old Theodore.
But no sooner had Puskás got his show on the road than tragedy struck in a bedroom right here beside the river Danube. This was how a newspaper reported it. The originator of Telefon Hirmondo died this day at 9 a.m. at his residence in the Hotel Hungaria at the age of 48. Puskás had suffered from rheumatism of the heart, but the catastrophe was quite unexpected. His wife could not wake him for his breakfast. But the show went on, under the guidance of Puskás's brother Albert, who then sold it on as a going concern. Telefon Hirmondo went from strength to strength.
Telefon Hirmondo continued to grow pretty much in step with the growth of the telephone service into the 20th century. We mustn't get out of step with reality. We're not talking in terms of millions of subscribers. We're talking in terms of perhaps as many as 10,000. But that was still, in its day, a very, very effective business. They were people who had money, important and influential people, and they mattered.
Neil Johansson. Of course, those 10,000 subscriptions represented far, far more than 10,000 listeners when family and friends were taken into account. And many others accessed Telefon Hirmondo via the normal telephone lines. Telefon Hirmondo also promoted the use of its service by subscribers in all manner of public situations, places like dentist waiting rooms, allowing an even larger part of the population of Budapest to benefit.
So there would be installations in hotels that were willing to sign up, railway waiting rooms in some instances, doctors' waiting rooms. They would be in gentlemen's clubs. Hairdressers. I mean, if you think about it, when you're sitting there waiting for your hair to be done or your hair to dry, what better thing to do than to be offered the opportunity to listen to the news? And once you've listened to it in the public place, if you can afford it, why don't we have one at home, dear?
So, if you fancied catching the late news at your favourite restaurant, well, with luck, the patron had a subscription to Telefon Hirmondo. Well, here in my Budapest hotel room, I'm surrounded by various sorts of communication systems. There's a telly over there on the wall with some morning news, something enlightening about, what is it, egg production, I think. I've got a radio, phone, free Wi-Fi, internet. It's not all that new, really, because way back in the 1890s, if your hotel had a subscription, well, there was Telefon Hirmondo on offer. Free. There'd be news, there'd be theatre, all sorts of music to listen to. Yes, live music. As this advert from the 1890s shows, Telefon Hirmondo had actually cut a deal with the illustrious Hungarian state opera.
Telefon Hirmondo központja között létesített hangátvívő összeköttetés lehetővé teszi. Telefon Hirmondo implemented a new system which will make it possible to broadcast the performances at the same time it's happening in the theatre.
I'm standing in the middle of the stage of the Hungarian State Opera House. And behind me, as you can probably hear, they're preparing the set for tonight's opera. It's going to be Rosenkavalier. And in front of me, the orchestra pit and the rest of the auditorium, just looking up 4 tiers of red satin seats. It really is absolutely beautiful. But what's most extraordinary is to think that on this stage, back in the 1890s, when the Opera House was virtually still new, the Telefon Hirmondo had 27 copper wires running from microphones placed right across this huge stage. And the microphone, well, they were just telephones. And what they did was they took the sound of the great arias and the choruses being belted out here back to Telefon Hirmondo headquarters. And from there, the operas were then redistributed to subscribers. You could actually sit down at home, pick up the telephone and listen to the opera coming to you live from the Hungarian State Opera House. Extraordinary. And on one occasion, maybe it wasn't all that unusual, we don't quite know, it was reported that an opera performance from here went live via telephone to places like Vienna, Berlin and Trieste.
The great Hungarian tenor, the so-called Hungarian Caruso, Béla Könnyei. Telefon Hirmondo even had its own critics at opera performances.
But why didn't this kind of telephone service take off somewhere more obvious? Well, they tried and failed to make money out of it in the States, although the reasons for its failure are not completely clear. If we look at London here, the world's great communications hub,
The idea of telephone news was reckoned to be an inducement to laziness or even distraction. And it was, anyway, seen as superfluous, says Neil Johansson.
We actually had a telegraph newswire system that could knock spots off the telegraph service anywhere else in the world. All the important information was into the people who wanted it very quickly. And we also had an incredibly good press. We didn't need to have a telephone news system because the press system and the telegraph system was doing it already.
In contrast, Telefon Hirmondo successfully bridged the divide between wired and wireless communication. Pushkash had created a scheduling format rooted in news that simply worked in the confined area of Budapest. Laszlo Jakab at the Telefonia Museum.
1925-ben indult a rádióközvetítés Magyarországon.
Radio broadcasts started in Hungary in 1925, and Telefon Hirmondo was merged with the radio. At first, the programming was the same, using the same studio. The final termination of Telefon Hirmondo came during the Second World War, when the cables were badly damaged during the siege of Budapest by the Russians. Although after that time, hospitals continued to receive a service, so the sick could listen to it.
We've discovered so very much pride in Pushkash and his Telefon Hirmondo here in Budapest. And one of our Hungarian voices in this programme, George Catullus, claims that Pushkash was more significant than many a Hungarian Nobel Prize winner.
It's almost a cliché that you will hear once you speak to a Hungarian, that Hungary has the highest number of Nobel laureates per capita, but most of them migrated from Hungary and they got the prize for work done mainly in the United States. But one of the interesting things about Pushkash is that he actually did what he's famous for in Hungary.
Well, my last port of call is the technical college named after Theodor Pushkash. There are all sorts of other things named after Pushkash all over Budapest. There are statues and there are foundations and there are societies. In a way, you wonder why so much honour is accorded to the inventor of a wired communication system, which gave way to, well, wireless. Perhaps his tragically early death played some part, but there's also the fact that a Hungarian beat the Americans at their own technological game. It was the potency of the idea behind Telefon Hirmondo, the idea that hundreds, thousands of people could simultaneously listen to the same sounds. A new community was born, invented, a community of listeners. This was broadcasting. And sometimes one is reminded that it's far from old-fashioned in its ambition. Only recently a friend told me that he'd heard my programme, my Radio 4 programme, as he travelled to London on the train. Oh, it was quite something, really, he said. I could hear it as clear as a bell on my mobile phone. I suspect that Pushkash would have smiled.